State Senator Hoon-Yung Hopgood, and welcome to another edition of the Hopgood Hour, my monthly public affairs show that brings the people of the 8th District news and views from Lansing. As always, please feel free to contact me with any of your questions or concerns about state government. You can give me a phone call, send me an email, or send me a letter in the regular mail. We will do our best to respond to you and try to address the issues or concerns that you have. This month's show, we're going to be talking about a really important issue for many of my constituents in the 8th District and many people here in the state of Michigan, and that is the issue of the minimum wage. Recently, there has been some significant action and activity on this issue, and so we're going to be talking about it today. I'm pleased to be joined by Mr. Frank Houston. He's an officer with Raise Michigan, and this is a group that has worked on this issue. And welcome to today's show.
Thanks for having me, Senator.
Thank you for being on. Why don't you just first tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Raise Michigan.
Well, I'll keep the comments on me pretty short, but I grew up in the district actually in Wyandotte, and I think I first got involved in these sorts of political issues when I was in college. I got elected to the city council in Ypsilanti, actually as a write-in. And once you are in and involved in this stuff, it's hard to get out. And over the years, I've worked on various campaigns, ballot initiatives for a lot of nonprofit policy work, and I also taught fourth grade for a little bit. And phasing into the campaign a little bit, the group that came together and started this were just a lot of folks like me. We had elected officials that were supportive and various other larger groups, but mostly it was a group of small nonprofit leaders that came together and said, we got to raise minimum wage in Michigan, and that's kind of how this got started.
So tell me a little bit about this issue of the minimum wage. What's going on with it? What needs to happen, or what happened?
Well, I mean, first, just taking a huge step back of why we launched a ballot initiative. And what we've seen is throughout history, there was a struggle to even create a minimum wage, and then there seems to be a struggle every couple of years to raise it. And unfortunately, since it doesn't go up with inflation, you have so many low-wage workers, not just in Michigan but nationally, who fall deeper and deeper into poverty every year, just working hard, playing by the rules, doing the same job they did the year before, but their wages don't go up. So particularly with low-wage workers, we've seen that with the failure for minimum wage to keep up with inflation, you have more and more people relying on government services, government programs that keep them out of poverty. And even with that, often they're not being, you have 341,000 children in Michigan who would be actually affected by minimum wage going up to $10.10 an hour, for instance. So this isn't just like high school students saving money for college like I did years ago, working at the big boys downriver on Jefferson. Most minimum wage workers in Michigan are adults, overwhelmingly. There's, I think, 12% are minors. Overwhelmingly, these are women. For instance, in the tipped industry, 74% of tipped workers in Michigan who are making right now $2.65 an hour are women. And we see a lot of them supporting families. Obviously, when you have 341,000 children that are being supported by a low-wage worker who would get a raise with our proposal, you have a really breadth of impact that this can have on people. And I think it's important to note that the biggest goal of our campaign was really to lift more people out of poverty who are working hard. And the reason we chose the 10-10 number for our campaign is it's really quite simple. We wanted to make sure a family of 3 could get out of poverty and at least above the official federal poverty line, which 10-10 does, particularly when you fast forward to the fact that our proposal would have not been fully implemented for 3 years. So with what the state now has done, they passed a minimum wage that would raise the minimum wage to $9.25 an hour. And although we think that's a step in the right direction for low-wage workers, candidly, we feel like it fell short on that goal of getting people above the federal poverty line. It just frankly doesn't do that for a lot of the people who are low-wage workers. One of the positives that we were really excited to see the legislature and the governor adopt was indexing the minimum wage for inflation, which means minimum wage most years will now go up with inflation. However, if our unemployment rate is high, over 8.5%, under the governor's proposal that was adopted, it unfortunately won't go up. So in a way, it's this oxymoron of like when low-wage workers are most hit is when there's high unemployment and they're forced to take a lower wage job or they're underemployed and taking a poor paid job, you have those folks now not getting raises when unemployment is highest, which is unfortunate. But at least most years it'll go up. The biggest problem I think our coalition had with the final proposal that they adopted that is different than ours is we believe that all workers in Michigan, and really nationally, should be guaranteed at least the full minimum wage. And we're not talking about a living wage here when you're talking $10.10 an hour or $9.25 an hour. And so, for instance, tipped workers in Michigan, there's this huge loophole, the tipped loophole, where tipped employees are making only $2.65 an hour in base pay. Now, by law, if they fall under making the $7.40 minimum wage in Michigan or $7.25 federally, you're supposed to be brought up to the full minimum wage by the employer. But I don't think there's a lot of enforcement to begin with. And secondly, put yourself in the worker's shoes. If you're a waitress at a restaurant and you've got a kid at home, do you want to spend every week having to go back to your employer and try to convince them the days that it was slow? And what type of dynamic does that set up if you're the problem employee who's always going to them saying, I didn't actually make minimum wage? You're forcing both the employer and the employee into this weird power dynamic. And unfortunately, particularly in the tipped industry, there's a lot of sexual harassment, there's a lot of intimidation issues that take place, and wage theft. And unfortunately, this whole tipped loophole where workers, even under this new proposal where they'll make $3.52 an hour, $3.52 an hour, there opens up this huge door for sexual harassment, intimidation, basically favoring certain employees in the workforce. For instance, one of our members, one of the nonprofits I work with, he worked on Saturday nights, made about $200 on a Saturday night in tips at an upscale Oakland County restaurant. Let's just say the manager moved him to a Tuesday night permanently. That was a $9,000 hit to his income in a year. Next thing you know, he's in foreclosure. So within a lot of these low-wage sectors, particularly in the tipped and restaurant industry, you have so many workers that volatility, paycheck to paycheck, leads to a cycle of poverty and economic uncertainty that's bad for everyone. So back to my original point, I think the biggest piece of work left undone here with what the legislature did and what we've been working to do is to make sure that all employees are at least getting the full minimum wage.
So now we have a state minimum wage that's in effect, and as you said, the state government, the legislature and the governor passed a bill, enacted into law, which would raise the minimum wage. Can you talk about what the effect of the bill that was passed will have on people? I mean, you said what percentage of minimum wage earners are adults?
Well, it's basically 88% of Michigan minimum wage workers are I believe, adults.
I mean, that's one of the myths, misconceptions out there that minimum wage is really about a beginning job for young people.
Well, and actually, let me clarify too that most of the numbers I really use are beyond just minimum wage workers. I use the numbers of who actually is impacted by a raise in the minimum wage. So just to differentiate what that means is, like for instance, with our proposal to raise the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, you have about 950,000 people in Michigan who would get a raise. Those aren't all minimum wage workers. A good, probably about half of those are folks who make over minimum wage. So the statistics I think are most telling when you talk about raising minimum wage to $9.25 an hour or $10.10 an hour is all the people who are really getting a raise. And what's so staggering is when you look at those numbers, when we talk about nearly 1 million people getting a raise under either of these proposals, really, that's 1 in 5 workers in Michigan right now, or it's roughly that. So you're talking about literally 20% of the people in the state who are working are going to get a raise right now. So when you talk about the benefits of this proposal that was adopted, later this fall, we're going to see people with more money in their hands. And these aren't folks, as I think everyone knows, when you're making $290 a week and you make a little bit more, you're not jetting off on a vacation to Europe. You're going to spend that money right where you live. So this is a great way to keep money circulating locally in the economy. It's good for small businesses and big businesses alike. It's good for workers that are struggling. And we think it's good for families. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that have kids that are low-wage workers. And one mother recently who I was talking about this was just like, I literally most days have to choose what meal we're skipping. And we live in America. I mean, that isn't the Michigan we want. That's not the country we want, nor should it be. When you're the wealthiest country in the world, your kids should go to bed every night with 3 meals in their belly and some snacks too. And unfortunately, for so many people who are trying to survive off minimum wage, that's just not possible.
So your campaign, the people that you're working with, they understood that, they got that. They said we need to look at this issue of raising the minimum wage, of giving people a raise, rewarding them for working. I mean, that's what this is all about. You go to work every day.
Fair pay for hard work.
I think people would argue that you shouldn't be stuck in poverty forever and ever. And so, can you just go back a little bit and talk about the process, or how you get something on the ballot, why that was chosen?
I've been involved in a few of these ballot initiatives. They're never easy, but they're always important. And when we started this campaign in particular, the reason why is we looked at how many people in Michigan were struggling to make ends meet, even with our economy slightly recovering. And the governor's quotes were pretty telling. I mean, he said this isn't a hot issue in Lansing. Legislators aren't talking about it. We had some of the representatives and senators here, like Senator Johnson, Representative Tlaib, Representative Swatowski, others were introducing bills. They weren't even getting committee hearings. And we tried to get meetings with the governor, didn't happen. So I think at some point, it's important, and I think one of the things that's great about Michigan's Constitution is we allow people here, if they feel like elected leadership either isn't listening or can't get a deal done on an issue, they can take it upon themselves to propose a law and turn that into law. So that's what we decided to do. And it was a group of, once again, community organizations, faith-based nonprofits, workforce development groups, a real community-based coalition without a lot of money, without a lot of capacity. And in the end, we collected 320,000 signatures, raised a significant amount of money to help with that effort, and submitted them to put this on the ballot. And in the end, we want this on the ballot still, make no question. But we understand that regardless, what's happened here is the work we did helped make the legislature act. And you look at all the steps along the way you have to do. You have to get the state to say the language that you're proposing is legal and it's a correctly written law. You have to get all these signatures from the public. Then, since this is a citizen-based initiative, it's important to remember that even before this would have ever ended up on the ballot, the legislature actually has the option of reviewing what we proposed and deciding whether or not to adopt it, or they could put a competing issue, a different proposal for minimum wage on the ballot. So it's a really great process that's designed to, I think, engage the citizenry and also give the legislature still a last option to try to address the issue. So that's the basic process, and I mean, we're still, I think, a little bit in uncharted water, though, right now of where this is going now, because, yes, the legislature passed a law, and we actually fulfilled our constitutional requirements to get something on the ballot. So arguably, you could say we could still end up on the ballot right now, but I think, as you know, Senator, one of the things that the legislature added to the final public act was a repeal of the current minimum wage law that ours was amending. So I don't want to make this overly complicated, but I think the biggest thing that I'm personally offended by is that when you have 320,000 people in the state sign something that they want on the ballot and want the legislature to take up, it's one thing for the legislature to pass a different law or to put a competing initiative on the ballot so voters have choices. It's another thing to do these kind of legislative shenanigans, trying to say that now this law can't go, or the proposed law can't even go on the ballot because of, I'd say, a little bit of trickery and legislative shenanigans. And it's very disappointing because it's arguably taking away this right that we've always protected in the Michigan Constitution for voters to be able to lead a citizen-initiated law. And potentially with what has happened here the last month with the legislature is taking away that right of the people. And so we do have some problems with that, although we're glad to see that the work we did helped spur a conversation with the legislature for once did something in a bipartisan fashion and passed at least something that's a strong step forward.
So this isn't the first time, I guess, in the last couple of years where the legislature has done something that has seemed to go against some of the processes that are available to people in the community, in the state, the citizens, to put something before the voters of the state. I think that you can look at the emergency manager law and the referendum process that was involved in that, and months later, the legislature just passed something that was tweaked a little bit and said, well, the old law is gone, and here's your new law, and so that kind of rubbed people wrong for the exact same sort of reasons. But I think you raise a good point there in terms of the process and the effort that Raise Michigan undertook was, I think, instrumental and I think necessary to get the legislature to act. It wasn't just the governor who said that's not a important issue. Legislative leadership was saying it's really not important. And that's history, and we can talk about that. But I did want to go back to the last time the minimum wage in Michigan was raised. Can you talk about that? Because what we're saying now in 2014 is that the minimum wage has lost some of its purchasing power, that people are losing to inflation. And can you talk about the last time the minimum wage was increased?
Well, I had just actually came home to Michigan at the end of 2004. In 2004, I led a ballot initiative in Florida, actually, with my now wife, to raise the minimum wage. And it passed with 71% of the vote in 2004 in the state of Florida. And I came back December of 2004, and I think I'd been back a week. And I started having people calling here saying, hey, would you be willing to help pull this together in Michigan for 2005 or 6? And what we did, myself, John Freeman, a few other folks who, John's a former legislator, what we did was first try to figure out a way we could make the legislature act. It was a Republican-controlled legislature, as you remember, and a Democratic governor. So we initially, a few of the nonprofit groups, we did, basically we put forward a set of principles and target wage levels and other policies, circulated to the legislature asking them to sign on and support. Unfortunately, every Republican refused to. And I'm not saying that for partisan reasons. Some of them called and explained why, but no one would sign any sort of pledge to rate. We were asking minimum wage to go up to $7.25 an hour at the time. None would do it. The governor was generally supportive, but didn't think she could push it. Several other legislators were supportive, but they didn't have the votes. So about September of 2005, we really started to have serious conversations about doing a ballot initiative. We did a big rally at the Capitol with 600-700 people. We started doing town halls across the state, sometimes with legislators or other supportive groups, sometimes with opponents, just to educate people. And by the winter, we were ready to launch. And then I think as many people in Michigan probably remember, within a month or two of launching that campaign, the legislature got serious about a deal, and which we think was actually a reasonable compromise at the time. We wanted $7.25 an hour, indexing for inflation, so it would keep going up, and a better definition to make sure more workers were covered. And instead, the Republican-controlled legislature and the governor came to a compromise where they didn't do indexing for inflation, so minimum wage wouldn't keep going up, but they at least raised it a little higher than we asked, the $7.40 an hour. So I think what we hopefully have learned from this experience the last couple of times is, I guess, one, when citizens take it upon themselves to form this sort of campaign, we can make our legislators listen and not just listen, but work together a little better, with a little bit more of a fire under their butt. But also, I think the second lesson here is that these issues don't go away. The issues of economic dignity, poverty, fairness in the workplace, these are issues that will always be here. And when we create public policy, it's important that we're trying to do things with both, not just a short-term impact, but a long view. For instance, if back in 2006, the legislature had adopted a proposal that made sure minimum wage went up with inflation for all workers, we wouldn't have just spent all this money and time and volunteer time getting all these signatures. The legislature wouldn't have been all of a sudden at the last minute having to spend a great deal of time negotiating out a new deal. I think some of these policies we really can address with a longer view instead of having to keep going back to. And unfortunately, this time too, I'll say, with tipped workers still only being treated the value of 38% of a full minimum wage worker, there's work left undone here. The fact is, like with tipped employees, you have more or less women and people of color being discriminated against for the type of work they do. And I think that opens up, honestly, federal lawsuits that the state could face later, as well as just the fact that you have a whole segment of the workforce that are going to fall, continue to spiral into poverty. So I think there's a lot of great steps forward here, but when we take on these issues, it's important that we're trying to figure out long-term solutions too.
How many people did you guys have in terms of like volunteers, and talk about the effort, because I think that that's an important thing whenever the citizens get together and try to do something talk about the effort that entails. How many people did you have out there? What were they doing?
I don't know. I mean, in the end, I don't have a final count, but I mean, we had well over 1,000 people circulating petitions. But it really takes a lot. I mean, I can't tell you how, like even one of the groups that I've worked with, the Restaurant Opportunity Center, we have a small restaurant, a training center for restaurant workers in downtown Detroit in Harmony Park. And we had probably an average of 50 people coming in and out every day for the last month working on this. And these are mostly people who are tipped workers, short-term unemployed, long-term unemployed, restaurant workers. So this is a lot of folks who economically, they have to take away time for their family or making money to help on something like this. They care. And we had a good group of people just in just that one office collecting, for the last month of the campaign, they collected about 30,000 signatures. So you talk a small group of 50 to 100 people, 100 different people just in that effort. Multiply that across the state with all the different nonprofit groups that were involved in this, and you had a really diverse effort. The challenges are, it's a lot of logistics, it's a lot of, you have to have some money to run these things. But what I've seen is when it's an issue that it really resonates with folks will come. If you build it, they will come. And if you, I think, show that they can actually win on an issue like this, it will likely lead them to being more engaged, more likely to vote, more likely to pay attention to what's going on in the Capitol or in their community. So I think the process overall in Michigan is a good one. I'm not pleased with how the legislature hijacked it at the end this time, but I think it's still this is all, I think, for the people who are involved, many whom don't even regularly vote. I saw it created a different level of engagement and commitment to, I think, making a difference and being engaged and knowing what their elected officials do. And we'll see if it works in the fall too, if people still vote and all those things. But I think for our coalition, what we've learned from this is that the groups involved in Raise Michigan don't see this as a one-time thing on minimum wage. This is just the first time this group came together on this issue. But when we look at other fundamental economic justice issues, like making sure that all workers can earn a paid sick day off when they're sick or they need to take care of a family member, making sure that is something that is encouraged and protected in the workplace, stopping wage theft, predatory lending. There's a whole set of these economic justice issues that now I think we're going to be looking closely at what's next for us. And don't be surprised if we're coming back to the ballot for more of them.
Well, I think that's probably one of the most important pieces of this. You hear from people out in the community and they think that they don't have power. I mean, they think that what they do in terms of participating or not participating in our democracy as a citizen isn't important. And I think that we're talking about that it really is, and especially we're talking about people who, as you mentioned, don't have a lot of resources in terms of what we think about, in money and, high wages and all those sorts of things. And yet they got this law changed. You talked about some of these other issues that are out there. What's next? I mean, you guys are going to work on?
Well, I think the next one, one of the other groups in our coalition, Mothering Justice, is a group that works on issues of financial stabilities for mothers and children primarily. And they've been a big proponent of making sure that in Michigan we have the right for all workers to get earned paid sick days. Our coalition right now is still in exploration phase, and we've done some polling and conversations around these things, but I think there's a very high likelihood that we move full forward on that. There's been legislation introduced by Representative Hobbs in the House, and I can't remember who introduced a bill in the Senate, but it's been I think it's Senator Ananek introduced it in the Senate. But it's one of those issues that we haven't been able to get even a committee hearing on. So I think when we look at some of those issues, when we look at impact on economic dignity and justice, that's an issue that's getting talked about a lot with our group. And then, we've worked on, all of our groups come from different things we've worked on public transit, we've worked on predatory lending issues, we've worked on workforce development. So I think all of us have other things that we're looking at, but I think that's the one, the earned paid sick days that will probably be next for our coalition. And once again, we hope we don't have to go through a ballot initiative, but in some ways it's good for the public. I think about where I grew up, and when I grew up in Wyandotte and I go back home to visit family, my brother, my parents, whoever, it doesn't matter if I'm talking to some of the small business owners I know or friends or whatever, when they hear about these things going on, it becomes a water cooler kind of conversation. Whereas if you guys just do something here, no offense to all of our great senators and representatives or the governor, it tends to be something that people just don't tune into as much. There's a very big difference between, and you know this, I mean, having knocked on tons of doors in your life, I'm sure, it's when you talk to someone face to face at a town hall or at a door versus them thinking it happened in some Capitol or ivory tower somewhere, it has a different connection and a different ability to lure someone into paying attention more long term.
Well, I think the other piece of that is that, you know, we have a system where people are supposed to represent us in our interests, but it's not completely up to the people that we send to Washington, D.C. or to Lansing.
Right.
We have a direct role. Is that what we're saying here?
I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, you look at, take minimum wage as an issue. The president, it was interesting. One of the things I found, and this wasn't just in Detroit, this was also the suburbs, that and really across the state, how many people thought that the minimum wage was already going to go up to $10.10 an hour because the president said he wanted to do it. It's like, I'm sure the president wishes he had a magic wand and could do it, but the reality is there's a little bit of opposition to it. So, or when the president announced he was going to raise it for the contractual federal employees, the $10.10 an hour. Once again, people are like, but I thought there was a whole segment of workers already getting it. Isn't it for everybody? So I do believe that the more we can directly engage people on issues that matter them and that they can see the ability for their concerns to be addressed and that government works, doesn't just exist but works for them, the better it is for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. It's what we all want.
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time, but I want to thank you for being on today's show, and it's been, I think, a good issue to talk about for our viewers. So
thanks for having me.
Thank you. Once again, this has been the Hopgood Hour. I'm State Senator Hoon-Yung Hopgood. We've been talking with Mr. Frank Houston with Raise Michigan. We've been talking about the minimum wage and rewarding work, and it's a really important issue for the 8th District and the people of Michigan. As always, please feel free to contact my office with any questions or concerns that you may have, and thank you for tuning in.